January 18th, 1813. The frozen air grew warm from musket fire and thick with gun smoke. The sound of cannons roared all around, and the boom filled my ears. I became horrified at the sight of my fellow soldiers' lifeless bodies lying on the battlefield. I found myself running in an effort to chase out the last of the enemy. Several of the British were escaping over a fence, so I slung my weapon over my shoulder and began to climb. Suddenly, a musket ball tore through my right arm and I plummeted toward the ground. More shots rang out as I landed on a blanket of snow, now stained red with the blood of my comrades that had come to aid in the pursuit.
This is the story of Antoine Momeny, a soldier in the American infantry during the War of 1812. He was one of the fortunate of 1,000 men to escape death or capture at the Battle of Frenchtown. Frenchtown, now called Monroe, Michigan, was fought for by Kentucky troops and won for a short time until British forces returned with a plethora of artillery and reinforcements. The result was a slaughter. Although the loss weighs deeply on the hearts of America, we as Americans can pay homage and commemorate the valor and courage displayed at the Battle of Frenchtown. This monument, along with a still-preserved battlefield, stand tall in Monroe, Michigan, and demonstrate to all who visit that the pride and fortitude the soldiers once possessed still exists within the people that call it home. These soldiers risked their lives for the freedoms we enjoy today. This is their story. The story begins in the year 1811. At this time, thousands of American settlers were pouring west across the Ohio River and into new western states and territories. As a result of this expansion, large numbers of discontented Native Americans flocked to the Prophet. The Prophet of the Shawnee tribe was well known among the native population for performing miracles and preaching rejection of the white man's ways. This mass gathering brought fear among white settlers of an upcoming Great War.
My heart is a stone, heavy with sadness for my people, cold with the knowledge that no treaty will keep the whites off our lands, and hard with the determination to resist as long as I live and breathe. Now we are weak, and many of our people are afraid. But hear me, a single twig breaks, but the bundle of twigs is strong. Someday I will embrace our brother tribes and draw them into a bundle, and together we will win our country back from the whites. Statement of Tecumseh.
War was indeed upcoming. To prepare, the Prophet's brother Tecumseh began a grand project of uniting all tribes into one mighty Native American confederation. On November 7, 1811, a clash occurred between American regulars, led by General William Henry Harrison, and Indians at the Prophet's village of Tippecanoe. In the end, Harrison inflicted a severe defeat to the outnumbered and surprised enemy. The battle, however, did nothing to persuade the general American opinion that British plotting and gun-running was responsible for stirring up the native population. To most Americans, the only real solution to peace was to seize control of Canada and drive the British off the continent. 5 months later, in April of 1812, the American Congress replied to British naval harassment on the high seas with a trade embargo and immobilization of state militias. On June 10, 1812, General William Hull, governor of the Michigan Territory, began moving a 2,000-man army north from Dayton, Ohio to Detroit, almost a 200-mile tread. Cutting a road through the dreaded Black Swamp, the 2-mile-long column stopped at Frenchtown on July 2nd. Here, they learned Congress had declared war on Great Britain June 18th, over 2 weeks earlier. It was immediately realized that a path was needed from Frenchtown to Detroit, allowing men and supplies through. The local militia was recruited and organized to help work on that path, aptly named Hull's Road. Due to the courage and morale of these militiamen, the road was quickly completed, allowing Hull's 2,000 men to reach Detroit by July 6th.
About 150 of the militia were collected with several teams, who proceeded onto the road under the command of Captain LaCroix. I went with them, my axe in hand to encourage all I could. The army arrived at the River Huron on the 4th of July. The bridge was not completed. It gave me pleasure to see the 4th Regiment take hold, who marched under the command of Colonel Miller. When he came to the bridge, he addressed them thus:
"Gentlemen, throw off your coats and take hold like men!"
The order was complied without murmur, and it was pleasing to see with what courage those men worked. The bridge was completed in a short time, and the army took up their line of march.
From Detroit, General Hull launched an invasion of Canada. By mid-July, he had captured Sandwich, but was unable to take the main British base of Fort Malden. The American situation quickly turned worse when, on July 28th, British forces captured U.S.-held Fort Michilimackinac. Worse still, Indians loyal to Tecumseh's Confederation had cut Hull's road in half. Without access to the road, Hull could no longer get vital supplies between Detroit and Frenchtown, 40 miles to the south. This also cut his one chance of retreat if the British decided to attack from the north. Desperate for men, Hull made 2 unsuccessful attempts at reopening the road, resulting in the battles of Brownstown and Mungwagon. Then, 2 colonels, Duncan MacArthur and Lewis Cass, tried to take a back trail to avoid the Indians. They too failed to reach Frenchtown and were forced to retreat back to Detroit. In the meantime, British General Isaac Brock had arrived at Fort Malden. With 330 British regulars, 400 Canadian militia, and 600 native warriors under the command of Tecumseh, Brock crossed the Detroit River to attack Hull's defenses at Detroit. Hull, unable to open his supply line and fearful of a native massacre of Detroit's civilian population, surrendered his entire force without trying to defend the city.
We cannot defend against such a great force. Surrender is our only option.
What am I supposed to tell the troops, sir?
Tell them we have no other choice.
Yes, sir.
Meanwhile, a second American army of 2,000 citizen soldiers had been hastily assembled at Georgetown, Kentucky, and placed under the command of General Harrison, the hero of Tippecanoe. On August 19th, they began marching northward to reinforce Detroit against the attacking British. 5 days later, upon arriving at Newport, they learned that Detroit had already fallen.
Well, General Hull is a much maligned figure of the War of 1812. Although he was governor of the territory of Michigan at the time, he's mostly remembered for surrendering Detroit without a fight at the beginning of the war. In fact, he was court-martialed and sentenced to death for that, and was only spared by a presidential pardon. One thing, though, that he did recognize very early in the war is the importance of Lake Erie. Whoever controlled the lake could control the passage of armies and supplies, and without a strong fleet on Lake Erie, he knew that he could not really hold Detroit. Unfortunately, the federal government did not get around to building a fleet on Lake Erie until much later in the war, and it was too late for General Hull.
These Kentuckians, however, were still eager for the fight. They crossed the Ohio River to Cincinnati and began a 50-mile trek to Piqua, located at the edge of the Ohio frontier. From Piqua, they marched to relieve Fort Wayne and then up to secure Defiance, where they rebuilt Mad Anthony's old fort. By late December, plans were being formulated to recapture Detroit during the winter season, when British warships on Lake Erie would be unable to interfere because of ice. American General James Winchester was ordered to march the Kentuckians on to the Maumee Rapids to await the arrival of 2 other armies coming from southern Ohio and western Pennsylvania.
The weather took a change the 2nd of January. It commenced snowing and continued 2 days and nights. After it ceased, it was from 20 to 24 inches deep. During this time, we remained stationary. On the 3rd, the Army resumed its march, wading through a deep snow. We had to stop early in the afternoon to prepare our encampment. To rake the snow away, make fires, and pitch our tents was no trifling task. And after this, we had to get bark and bushes to lie on. Many of the horses gave out, and sleds broke down. Consequently, the plunder had to be pulled or carried by the men. I have seen 6 Kentuckians substituted instead of a horse, pulling their plunder, drudging along through the snow, and keeping pace.
Unfortunately for the Americans, events were to bring on an engagement before the armies could be united. When Winchester arrived at the rapids, he received word that a small force of British, Canadians, and Indians had occupied Frenchtown and was committing depredations against American civilians.
General Winchester, sir.
What is this I hear of depredations at Frenchtown?
It's true, sir.
Then inform my officers that I will meet with them tonight.
Yes, sir.
General Winchester, at the head of the left wing of the Northwest Army, arrived at the rapids of the Maumee on the 10th of January, 1813. On the 16th, at night, he called the field officers together and asked their opinions on the subject of detaching a part of his command and sending them to the River Raisin.
Gentlemen, I now ask your opinion.
I completely object to a detachment. We're already spread too thin.
The next morning, a detachment was sent under the command of Colonel Lewis, and on the same day, at 1 o'clock, another detachment under Colonel Allen followed the first.
March your men to the Raisin and then on to Frenchtown. The citizens up there need you.
Yes, sir, I will do so with honor and speed.
Then go.
On January 18, 1813, Winchester dispatched Colonel Lewis from Presqu'Isle across ice-covered Lake Erie. Lewis arrived at La Plaisance with 667 men, mostly Kentucky militia, and was joined by nearly 100 Frenchtown citizens who came gun in hand to help fight the British.
Soldiers, your ancient enemy is upon you. The wounds inflicted upon your country are fresh in your memory. That country has called you to duty today to vindicate her honor and her interests by inflicting on him condign punishment. In this hour of battle, remember the words of the great orator at Georgetown. You have due character as Americans and Kentuckians to sustain. Do so, as I am assured you will, and all will be well.
Huzzah! Huzzah! Huzzah!
Waiting for Lewis along the north side of River Raisin were approximately 75 Canadians from the 1st Essex Militia, a few British regulars and artillerymen, 1 small cannon, and nearly 200 Indians, mostly Potawatomis. It was after 3 p.m. on the 18th by the time the American line was formed and began to emerge onto the open prairie a quarter-mile south of the river. The British cannon opened fire, followed by musketry. This did not stop the Americans, however, who continued to move forward, led across the slippery river ice by an advance guard under Captain Bland Ballard. As the Americans closed in, the British commander, Major Ebenezer Reynolds, began a stubborn retreat through Frenchtown and off towards the northeast.
On the 18th day of January 1813, I accompanied the American detachment from Otter Creek to the River Raisin, under arms in the express purpose of defending the place against the enemy who was there in the immediate vicinity. In arriving at the River Raisin, the enemy discharged their artillery at the Americans, but the detachment nevertheless advanced and had quite a warm skirmish battle until day the enemy were forced to retire.
The left and center of the American line easily secured the town and its buildings. The right wing, however, under the command of Colonel Allen, was having difficulties. They halted in an open field and soon thereafter began receiving heavy sniper fire from nearby buildings and fence rows. Allen ordered his men to fall back out of range of the natives' muskets, but still in range of his own riflemen. Seeing Allen's difficulty, Colonel Lewis sent a column against the right flank of the enemy snipers. With this support, Allen ordered a charge which drove the snipers from the buildings and deep into the forest, where fighting continued tree to tree. Occasionally able to bring their cannon into play, the British carefully retreated behind a screen of native skirmishers.
The retreat of the gun was covered by a brave band of Indians who made the enemy pay dearly for what they had obtained. This party, composed of militia and Indians with the gun, fell back 18 miles to Brownstown.
Fighting continued until that night when darkness ended the action.
I believe the Americans won on the 18th of January because, number one, they had superior numbers. They were definitely outnumbered the defending forces. And 18th century warfare styles, early 19th century, tended to favor the attacking force. Inertia, once underway, could carry troops, quite a distance. And I think this was kind of a classic situation that the Americans pushed the Canadians and Native Americans out of the Frenchtown and pursued them deep into the woods for a mile aggressively. So I think that the fact that they were the attacking force, they were ready for a fight, and maybe they were motivated by the opportunity to have some better accommodations than they had recently by occupying the village.
John Moore McCalla, a captain with the 5th Kentucky Volunteer Regiment, wrote this letter to his parents on January 21, 1813, 3 nights after the battle.
Dearest parents, return thanks with me for my life preserved. I have at length been in an action on the 18th, the place where I long to be. I have seen the enemy, and I have seen him defeated. I have seen my fellow soldiers lifeless, bloody corpses on the ground, and many others groaning in agony from dangerous wounds. I have heard balls whistling as thick as a pattering hail around me, and yet not been touched even in my clothes. I wondered that I should escape and expected every ball would be for me. Our movements have been continually advancing, generally in a run. Once, the right wing halted for a movement of the left, but only for a short time. The inhabitants are numerous and very friendly. They are almost to a man in our favor. Several took arms and fought valiantly at our sides. Our loss is 13 killed, 55 wounded. Captain John Moore McCullough, Adjutant, 5th Kentucky Volunteer Regiment.
Returning from battle, the Kentuckians established their camp inside the fences of the town. 2 days later, on the 20th, General James Winchester arrived to take command. He established his headquarters at the home of Francis Navarre, 3/4 of a mile away on the opposite side of the river.
Well, General Winchester is often heavily criticized for what appears to be a lack of planning on his part for fighting the Battle of the River Raisin. In the first place, in setting up his forces, the bulk of the militia were quartered inside the picketed fences of Frenchtown, but he set up his own headquarters about 3/4 of a mile away from his troops in the home of Francis Navarre on the opposite side of the river. Also, when reinforcements arrived, they camped in the open to the right of the main body of troops. And there's no real explanation for why they did this, other than to stay away from the unruly militia that were then inhabiting Frenchtown. This is in sharp contrast to the way General Winchester acted in his advance up the Maumee River, which was very cautious. He built a fortified camp at every stop, and he failed to do this at Frenchtown, and that remains somewhat of a mystery.
Colonel Samuel Wells arrived with reinforcements 12 hours later at 2 p.m. and established camp in an open field approximately 40 yards east of any other troops. No special precautions were taken to guard against a British counterattack. The British response to the loss of Frenchtown was not long in coming. Colonel Proctor, commanding Fort Malden, scraped together a force of 525 British and Canadian soldiers, 6 light artillery pieces, and nearly 800 native warriors. The native force, led by Wyandot chiefs Roundhead and Walk in the Water, consisted of warriors from the Wyandot, Potawatomi, Ottawa, Chippewa, Miami, Sauk, Fox, Delaware, and Winnebago nations. Leaving only a handful of men to protect the fort, Proctor's forces marched themselves and their artillery across the Detroit River and headed for Frenchtown.
On the 18th of January, 1813, being the anniversary of old Queen Charlotte's birthday, all the young fellows combined with the military to give a ball. We assembled at Mrs. Draper's Tavern here in Amherstburg, and all the lads and lasses were full of dance and fun when in walked Colonel St. George, equipped for the field.
My boys, you must prepare to dance to a different tune. The enemy are upon us and we are going to surprise him.
The ball broke up at once, and every man was at his post at the appointed time. It had been very cold, but no snow had fallen. We started from Brownstown, 4 miles distant, across the ice. Statement of Squire Reynolds of Amherstburg.
Before dawn on January 22, 1813, Proctor's army deployed in the brush along Mason Run, several hundred yards north of the American camp. British regulars made up the center, with militia and Indians on the flanks. In a very unique strategic move, Proctor ordered his artillery in front of the main lines, leaving them susceptible to American rifle fire. As the drums beat morning reveille throughout the American camp, a sentry suddenly noticed British lines approaching. He immediately fired into their ranks, putting a lead ball through the lead grenadier. In response, Proctor's artillery began firing onto American camps within Frenchtown. The Kentuckians, under bombardment, scrambled from their beds to take positions behind the fences surrounding the town. War cries rang out from the Indians, and Proctor ordered his men to advance. The British flanks moved into the east side of Frenchtown, allowing the militia and Indians to take positions inside the captured buildings. Combined with British artillery fire, their muskets began inflicting severe damage to the American regulars still positioned in the open field. Back at Navarre's house, General Winchester was enjoying breakfast when he heard the gunfire. In a hurry to reach his men, Winchester quickly found his horse and took off towards the battlefield. For 20 minutes, the regulars held their ground despite being attacked from 2 sides. They finally began to give way when flanked by a party of Indians. As the Indians began to surround the Americans, General Winchester arrived. He ordered the regulars to fall back to a better position at the mouth of the river. The pressure was too great, however, and the retreat became a chaotic rout.
The turning point of the battle on January 22nd came when Chief Roundhead of the Wyandots succeeded in leading his warriors around the right flank of the 17th U.S. Infantry. That caused the collapse of the entire flank. They fled across the River Raisin and completely disintegrated as a fighting force. That led to the loss of about 40% of General Winchester's forces.
Reinforcements, militiamen sent from the left wing and under the command of Colonel Allen, were quickly caught up in the panic and swept across the river along with the fleeing regulars. The Americans made several attempts to make a stand, but nothing could stop the oncoming enemy. Warriors eventually flanked the regulars before a serious defense could be established. The last organized group of Kentuckians were finally exterminated in an ambush near Plum Creek, a mile and a half south of the river. Colonel Allen, who was in full retreat alongside the men, was eventually surrounded and killed. General Winchester, on horseback and in full retreat, was ambushed by a group of Indians and captured. Stripped of much of his clothing and nearly frozen, he was taken to Colonel Proctor.
Just before dawn, I was feeding my daughter Monique when I heard the cannon firing. It seemed like hours before it stopped. Ambrose, my husband, was away somewhere with his men, and I didn't know if he was in the fighting again or not. Later in the afternoon, an officer came to the door and told me that all the soldiers were being killed, and there were dead men all over the trail. Just then, we saw 3 Indians coming down the creek. I knew they wouldn't hurt the French women and children, so I put a large barrel over him. The Indians walked right in. I gave them a loaf of fresh bread, and they left. The officers stayed until dark and then left, going toward the Maumee.
Meanwhile, the remaining Kentuckians took shelter behind the fences surrounding Frenchtown. The British, in the early morning darkness, mistook these fences for troops, giving the illusion that the militia had twice as many men as they really had. The British regulars stormed the fences but were thrown back. The brave, outnumbered Kentuckians awaited another British attack. Again, the British rushed but were forced to retreat. With heavy casualties mounting on both sides and British frustration rising, the British attacked a third time. With sheer determination, they advanced in close-order assault columns to the fence. Getting as close as 20 feet, the British finally retreated, unable to hold their ground. On the last British rush, one cannon was abandoned less than 20 yards from the fence. Seeing it as an important defense, several Kentuckians ran out to capture it, but were driven back by British musket fire. British Lieutenant Irving of the Provincial Marines, although wounded, finally managed to drag it back to British lines.
The conduct of Colonel Proctor on this occasion has ever been a matter of astonishment to me. The Americans were lying in their beds, undressed and unarmed, and a prompt and forward movement of the line either would have enabled us to have taken them with the bayoneted advantage or to have seized the intermediate close fence. Instead of this, he commenced firing his 3-pounders in answer to the alarm of the sentinels, thus affording them time for arming and occupying the only position from which they could seriously check our advance. Resting their rifles on the breastwork by which they were covered, the Americans fought under every advantage.
A number of Frenchtown civilians joined in the fighting, doing considerable damage to the British by firing from the windows of nearby buildings. One group, positioned inside L'Enfant's horse mill, was sent tumbling out of the building when a shell from a British howitzer set the place on fire. Lacking success, the British decided to alter their strategy. They shifted their artillery to their flanks, trying to capture buildings between the positions of the Americans. This would allow the British shelter and a clear shot at the militia. Accurate Kentucky fire, however, forced the artillerymen to withdraw. Synchronously, volunteers rushed out to burn the strategically important buildings before they could be occupied by the British. At about 10 a.m., a lull descended on the battlefield. As the Kentuckians began to think about getting breakfast, they noticed a British officer approaching under a white flag. Major George Madison went out to meet him, expecting the British to ask for a truce to remove their dead and wounded. To his surprise, he was instead presented with a note from the captured General Winchester advising him and his men to surrender.
I understood that our troops were defending themselves in a state of desperation, and was informed by the commanding officer of the enemy that he would afford them an opportunity of surrendering themselves prisoners of war, to which I acceded. I was the more ready to make the surrender from being assured that, unless done quickly, the buildings adjacent would be immediately set on fire, and that no responsibility would be taken for the conduct of the savages, who were then assembled in great numbers.
The troops, the Marine, and the militia displayed great bravery and behaved uncommonly well. Where so much zeal and spirit were manifested, it would be unjust to attempt to particularize any. I cannot, however, refrain from mentioning Lieutenant Colonel St. George, who received 4 wounds in a gallant attempt to occupy a building which was favorably suited for annoying the enemy. the Indian warriors fought with their usual bravery. Brigadier General Winchester was taken in the pursuit by the Wyandotte Chief Roundhead, who afterwards surrendered him to me.
Native Americans and white settlers had fought each other for generations on the frontier, and neither Indians nor Kentuckians expected any mercy from their enemies. After some negotiation, however, the Kentuckians agreed to surrender upon condition that they and their wounded would be protected from the vengeance of the Indians. The British immediately rounded up their prisoners and herded them off towards Fort Malden. They ended up leaving approximately 60 wounded Americans in Frenchtown under the care of civilian doctors and a small British guard.
The appearance of the American prisoners captured at Frenchtown were miserable to the last degree. They had the air of men to whom cleanliness was a virtue unknown. It was in the depth of winter, but scarcely an individual was in possession of a greatcoat or cloak, and few of them wore garments of wool of any description. They still retained their summer dress, consisting of cotton stuff of various colors, shaped into frocks and descending to the knee. Their trousers were of the same material. They were covered with slouched hats, worn bare by constant use, beneath which their long hair fell matted and uncombed over their cheeks, and these, together with the dirty blankets wrapped around their loins to protect them against the inclemency of the season, gave them an air of wildness and savageness.
During the Battle of the River Raisin, my son, Whitmore, was captured at the battle here alongside General Winchester. When the fighting ended, the Indians invaded my home and delivered me to Colonel Proctor. I pleaded with Proctor not to punish my son. He had only come back to the River Raisin to visit me, his poor old mother. But the colonel wouldn't listen. He sent my son off in chains to Quebec to be tried for violation of his parole.
After Winchester's defeat, I saw an Indian, his wife, and his son, a boy about 15, with a prisoner they had taken in that fight. He proved to be Captain Baker of the U.S. Infantry. I told him I knew the Indian, whose name was Watusan, who lived at the mouth of the Maumee River. Watusan and his son Wasanaket, who was with his father in the battle, told me the night after they captured Captain Baker they encamped in the woods. The snow a foot deep and it being very cold, his father told him to get some wood and make a fire. He said to his father,
"Why don't you make that Yankee dog do it?"
His father said,
"Do not call him a Yankee dog. He is a war chief when at home. Treat him as if you would treat me if I was a prisoner of the Long Knives."
Having removed their own wounded by sleigh, the British promised to soon return for the wounded Americans. The next morning, however, some Indians returned, very angry and demanding revenge. They ran from house to house, killing those too weak to walk and taking the rest as personal captives. As a last act of revenge, the Indians set fire to the buildings in Frenchtown. Many Americans, too wounded to escape, died in the flames.
The prisoners and many of the wounded were removed safely, but some of the wounded, too much hurt to be moved, were left in the stockaded houses. The Indians, not Tecumseh's people, but the Indians of the lake under Dixon, prowlers and plunderers who, it is believed, did not fight at all, assailed the prisoners. The guard was insufficient. It is feared that some of the wounded were murdered, too. It was a sad affair and caused intense feeling in our camp.
Thus ended one of the most frightful disasters ever endured by an American army. Of 934 soldiers engaged in the battle, only 33 escaped death or capture. The British regulars also had suffered severely. Already stretched too thin to effectively control all the territory they had conquered, their 24 dead and 169 wounded, including 11 officers, were losses they could ill afford. However, amongst these tragedies, there shined a ray of hope which illuminated upon the now unstoppable American forces. News of the massacre spread like wildfire throughout not only the Army, but the entire country. Remember the Raisin became the new battle cry, helping to recruit troops and win back the Old Northwest from the British. Commodore Oliver Hazard Perry conquered the British fleet and regained control of Lake Erie's waters. Without control of Lake Erie, the British could not hold Detroit, and British General Henry Proctor began retreating across Ontario. American General William Henry Harrison pursued them, finally bringing the British troops to battle on the Thames River. The American army of 3,500 troops, mainly Kentucky volunteers, quickly overpowered the British force of regulars and native warriors. The Battle of the Thames effectively eliminated Proctor's army and resulted in the death of the noble native leader Tecumseh. Tecumseh's death was a crushing blow to the ideal of a Native American confederation. Losing him, Native Americans lost their last chance at unification. When we think of the War of 1812, we think of such things as bravery, valor, honor, and an undying duty to fight for America's freedom. These traits were exemplified through the spirits of our American soldiers on the shores of the River Raisin. We as Americans should take the time to understand their sacrifice, realize their courage, and ultimately, remember the Raisin.